We should be live now. Hello there, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning. My name is Mr. Geocon, and this is the 14th episode of the Geoconservative Files. Or was it? Is it the 14th?
Yes, it is the
I can,
14th. I'm looking at the page right now. Yes.
I always get. I always get confused with the numberings for whatever reason. But anyways, whatever its numbering, I'm having a very special guest here, Renaissance Man. He's a YouTuber that I've admired ever since he started his channel. He used to go by Mauritian Struggle, and apparently there are a lot of people who did not know that you used to be Mauritian Struggle, and that you still have your YouTube channel, Mauritian Struggle.
Well, yeah, because what I wanted to do was I kind of wanted to segment away a previously kind of political past that I had, and I thought it would be an apt idea to start something new. So I started working on, practical virtue kind of stuff. Teaching, because I saw that there was a lack of knowledge both on my part and on the part of a lot of people, on the internet in general, about how to manage lives, how morality is manifest in like beyond obviously what we know from our consciences. And so I thought, well, I would do something like that to help people out.
Yes, indeed, and that's probably what I liked about your channel. And in some ways, your channel and am I still going through? My screen is frozen.
Oh, no, you are. I can still hear you loud and clear.
Oh, okay. Well, anyways, I would consider my channel to be in part inspired by your channel, in that we both want to focus on virtue ethics as the sort of focus of our channel. Although while you go into the more practical life advice, I'm more into the sort of nuts and bolts theory of it. Making videos about how effeminacy plays a part in political correctness, for example.
I see. Yeah.
And that's sort of what I wanted to talk about today. The sort of Christian virtue ethics that you might see in that you might see on a sort of implied on Catholic channels, but usually it's not as explicitly spelled out. So maybe you could here give a sort of broad overview of what is virtue ethics and why should we believe it?
Okay, so virtue ethics is basically the theory wherein we follow specific, discrete rules such that we can maximize the use of our faculties. So, for example, the proper use of the sexual organs would be better ordered towards chastity, for example. Chastity relates to, sex and things like this, right? And the reason why we would follow a virtue ethicist lifestyle as opposed to, say, a deontological one is that it's ultimately focused on what the human being actually is in a physical, well, not necessarily physical, but in an actual sense. Whereas deontology and maybe consequentialism can kind of lose sight of that. We want a morality that is ultimately very human focused, but doesn't fall into the same subjectivism as, say, utilitarianism.
So you would say that the other two alternative theories, the kind of deontological theory of someone like Immanuel Kant, and the consequentialist theory of someone like... Hold on a second.
Okay.
The consequentialist theory of the utilitarians, would be... they would lose sight of what is good for humans Would you say that that's an accurate summary of what you just said?
Well, I think that deontology can become a little bit tedious and a little bit arbitrary, right? That doesn't mean that, say, there aren't such a thing as an intrinsic evil. Of course there are. In fact, we can derive this through virtue ethics. But it has a tendency, from all I have seen of it, to be somewhat arbitrary. Whereas consequentialism, I think, really is just a cope for people who want to do immoral things. Or at least things that would be considered immoral from a deontological or a virtue ethics perspective, and try and skirt that by saying that they're judging it by consequences that they can't possibly exhaustively know.
I remember once hearing an argument from a Christian lame person, a Christian author. You might know him, Christopher Lansdowne of Missing the Mark channel.
Yeah. I know.
He once made an argument that in order to be a consequentialist, you'd have to be basically omniscient, because you wouldn't be able to know all the consequences of every single one of your actions, especially if you take into account what's popularly known as the butterfly effect.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the only true consequentialist could be God.
Yeah, and there's a good case to be made that he isn't actually a consequentialist, but that's you're perfect. I think you're right on that. So I think so. Why should what is unique about specifically Christian virtue ethics as opposed to maybe someone who is practicing virtue ethics in the kind of classical Greek view, or maybe some of the modern variations like feminist virtue ethics of care?
Well, I would say that the principal and most obvious difference between, say, Aristotle's ethics and, say, the ethics of St. Thomas Aquinas would be the inclusion of infused virtues. So faith, hope, and charity. That would be the most obvious one. And then the second most obvious one would be, well, one is based on the Bible and one isn't.
And I think that's the what do faith, hope, and charity add to these older views of virtue ethics that completes them or makes it better?
Well, I would say that okay, so the ideas fundamentally of, say, like classical ethics versus Christian ethics are very similar. But you see from Plato, I can't specifically speak for Aristotle, that love takes very much a backseat. I read the Symposium of Plato for a couple of days yesterday, and I'm going through the Phaedra right now, and they all of these sorts of Platonic or Platonic derived philosophers kind of downplay love, whereas Christianity, having a far more robust idea of love than they do, as God being love, they're far more able to make that excel in human beings. And I think if we're going to talk from specifically, perhaps ironically, consequential effects, I think it helps a lot more with the cohesion of the community. Because if memory serves me, although of course civic virtue is a thing, there's something about infused virtues, specifically charity, that binds people together in a far more organic way than purely civic virtue. I would say, anyway. It feels more genuine.
I do agree with that, and I would also say that in particular hope, I've seen a lot of modern political commentators that they seem to give into despair, and hope is a great counter to despair. When I speak of hope, I mean the theological virtue of hope, because I see despair as a sin deriving from the sort of belief that God isn't going to save us, or that God's salvation ultimately doesn't matter in some real way. And while modern society does give us a lot of reasons to be saddened by the state of affairs, and especially the state of affairs of men's immortal souls. I don't think that losing sight of hope and losing sight of that kind of salvation that God brings, I don't think that I don't think that's a very wise thing for them to do. And
Well,
I don't
you
think that.
see, you can't have heaven without faith in, I suppose, an afterlife, or more specifically, heaven, right? And you've got a lot of people who, of course, don't believe in heaven. They don't even believe in such a thing as a soul, contrary to all of the evidence. So, I mean, it's no wonder they despair. Even the pagans believed in the immortal soul.
Yeah, but I see even my fellow Christians who, I mean, who comport themselves as if there is no afterlife and that God will not save us in the end.
Well, I mean, then they just haven't read the Bible then.
That's it. I guess that's pretty true. Hey, before we move on, there is a person in the chat um, who's arguing about Kantian ethics and the ethics of German idealism. And he says that it comports nicely with Christianity because they both espouse individualistic ethics. Would you like to comment on that?
I don't have any particular comment since I'm not a massive expert in Kant, but knowing what little I do of the categorical imperative, the fact that we should love humans for their own sake, I don't like that aspect. We should love humans for God's sake, you know. Pagans can love humans for their own sake. I think that the desire to love human beings, well, the requirement rather to love one's neighbor because of what God commands us, is, well, infinitely superior to just telling people to like each other. So I'm not sure if it would completely ideally comport with Christianity, but at the same time, I don't know enough to say.
Right. I would largely agree with that. Now now I as much as I'd love to talk more about deontology and Kantian ethics, I'm afraid that you have us at a disadvantage because I don't think either of us have read enough of Kant to fully comment on his ethics. What I will, I mean, I know more about Kant's views of epistemology than his ethics right now.
Pre-sup, yeah,
Yeah,
basically.
yeah. So it would require a lot more reading. But yeah, just be nice, bro. Yeah, that's a thing that you see within modern life, and I'll say that there is a. I will get to that critique later, but now I want to go. From now, I want to go on to the sort of critiques that you see coming from people who, with more secular views of ethics, that make critiques of Christian ethics and Christianity in general. One of the most famous of them, which was, I believe, first espoused by Friedrich Nietzsche, oh, darn it. Okay. So Friedrich Nietzsche, um, his view of things basically said that Christianity makes men effeminate because it emphasizes pity for the weak, thereby commanding us to eliminate suffering. But in doing so, it eliminates the preconditions for excellence and makes human beings weaker and softer and more ignoble. And the end result of these trends, one of the end results of this trend towards elimination of suffering, is the rejection of punitive justice, which is a precondition of the social order. And so our society breaks down because we're too soft and weak to do anything about the antisocial elements of it. And so when you see someone saying like Pope, and you see this mostly coming from the radical right, they'll say, well, when Pope Francis says that true defeat for a Christian is to succumb to the temptation of responding to the world's resistance with violence, or that the only weapons the Christian possesses are the gospel and the hopeful assurance that God is by their side. And, or when he denounces weapon manufacturers as unchristian, or says that Europe needs to accept more foreign immigrants regardless of the cost. The Nietzschean would say that this is demonstrative of the fundamental weakness and sentimentality that Christianity encourages. What would you say to someone who is making this sort of critique?
Well, first of all, I'd ask them where the pagans were who believed in the master morality that they hold. I'd ask them, where are they? I mean, if they're so powerful and their moral views are so superior, how is it that they all disappeared? That'd be the first thing I'd say. Second of all, if Nietzsche possesses this master morality, then how are his intellectual successors, people like Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, right? How can, if this sort of neo, I suppose you call it atheist, existentialist, view of morality is so brilliant, then why are the intellectual successors in that tradition, frankly, not of the kind of political caliber that these people judge worthy? That would be another question, because if it is such a great moral system to follow, wherein there's punitive justice and everything, where are their forebears? It clearly doesn't work.
Well, okay, so, to respond to that, so someone from the radical right who follows Nietzsche would say, these people, they distorted Nietzsche to fit in with their liberal preconceived notions. But Nietzsche would find the egalitarianism of someone like Jean-Paul Sartre or Simone de Beauvoir as being antithetical to the kind of master morality that he was intending. And he would, and this guy would point to this kind of macho man type of morality that says we should be strong, unapologetic, reject the human dignity of the outsider, because they would just, yeah.
Wait, you mean that? You mean the same master morality that was crushed in Berlin in 1945?
I mean, that's it. Well,
it's so macho,
thing, right? Well, you have to understand that just because the idea that it was crushed and it was defeated and therefore it's wrong, it doesn't follow logically.
Well, I mean, you see, the thing is that if it's a master morality, you'd expect it to be masters over things, wouldn't you? But it isn't. That was my point. I'm not gonna. I can argue like against it logically, but I think it's a lot more effective to point out how ridiculous quote unquote master morality is when it doesn't master anything.
That's a pretty good point to establish that kind of, for all of the potential benefits of master morality, one of the things that it lacks is a way to counter against.
Well, they're not masters.
Counter against the so-called victim morality.
Nietzsche himself wasn't a master. Like, who could you argue was maybe like a master? A man whose name begins with H. What, for 12 years, and then he ended up, swallowing
committing
a bullet.
Suicide.
Yeah, swallowing a bullet. Yeah, it doesn't sound like it's too effective to me. But if we go for logical arguments to Christianity now, I would rebut the charge that Christianity is this sort of airy-fairy religion purely on the basis of the fact that we have a just war theory. Now, nowadays, that's been toned back because wars are far more brutal and far more liable to lead to injustice than they ever were before, with the invention of things like cluster munitions and things like that. But we do actually have a just war theory, wherein wars can be waged for just reasons. That's what the Crusades were. They were killing pilgrims. I think it was one of the leaders of the Seljuks just killed the Patriarch of Jerusalem just because. And so, the Crusaders went down there, reconquered a lot of the land, also helped out the Byzantines at the same time. And you have that problem solved. to suggest that Christianity is this kind of I'm going to lie on my back and just take it because I'm a weakling thing, I think it shows that Nietzsche was definitely a philologist by trade and to some extent a philosopher, but he certainly wasn't a historian nor a theologian.
I actually would agree, and I think what shaped arguably what shaped Nietzsche was not his view of Christianity per se, as it was historically practiced, but rather the kind of liberal sentiments that he saw in the Christians in his life. Anyone I've reading from the Church Fathers, I don't think you could read something like the martyrdom of Polycarp and take away that these people were these kinds of effeminate weaklings. They clearly weren't.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised. I mean, he was around in the time period in Christianity where you had Adolf Harnack trying to historicalize it. A little bit after him was the famous modernist Loisy, who tried to do all kinds of strange things. You had Bultmann, who denied the resurrection. You had all of these modernist philosophers, modernist theologians who were in particularly the German Academy. The German academies from the very latest, I'd say it's probably been there for a lot longer than this, but the very latest from the 1770s have been very, very persuasive in interpretations of the scripture. And it basically liberalized it, a higher criticism. We're only just recovering from the higher criticism that was really rampant in the 19th century. What was the name of the guy that came up with the documentary hypothesis? What was his name? I'm going to Google that. Very important German theologian. Wellhausen, that was it. Julius Wellhausen. Didn't even have to Google it. Yeah, his ideas regarding the Pentateuch were all about, and there was this high level of dissatisfaction with Christianity and this demythologization going on, while at the same time, this fervent emotional religiosity that was going on across Europe through the pietist movements that Nietzsche's father was actually a minister for. That happened, call it 100 years beforehand, but also you had the different Great Awakenings in America. So you had a very emotional religiosity from the masses that he would have considered slaves, but also this very cynical, a very liberal theology from most of the professors at the universities he would have been at. So that would have been his exposure. He wouldn't have gotten this exposure if he'd been, say, in maybe in Rome. If he'd been at the Angelicum or something like that, he would have come out with a completely different idea of Christianity.
Agreed. Yes, and I think that's Nietzsche's, the kind of hard right people who borrow Nietzsche's critique make the similar intellectual mistake when they talk about Christianity being soft, and when they talk about Christianity Christianity being weak. They're exposed to similar environmental factors like cynical liberals or like cynical liberal theologians or very emotional mass Christian forms of Protestantism. I think that's a factor in their critique too.
Yeah, also, I think that to call Christianity the Platonism of the people, as he did, was tremendously... I mean, I have to wonder if he actually read any Christian theology at all, which of course is influenced by Plato, but not nearly to the extent he thinks.
I see. So it's kind of interesting going from this to the kind of the other critiques of Christianity, because most of the critiques of Christianity you hear coming from secularists are the exact opposite. Whereas Nietzsche would have said Christianity is too soft and effeminate, these people would say that Christianity is too harsh and repressive and brutal, which is a kind of an interesting contrast. It really goes to show that there's this kind of vices come in twos, and so do heresies. This is the opposite heresy of Nietzsche, whereas they denounce Christianity for its brutal oppression.
Well, I mean, what I'd say to the progressives, the two things I would say, right? The first one is "Vae Victus," woe to the vanquished, and second of all, St. Paul in Romans says, "Suffering breeds endurance, endurance breeds character, and character breeds hope." If you cannot suffer, then how can you expect to hope for anything?
Mm. Yeah, I think a lot of the so what the one of the common complaints about from these kinds of atheist types is that they often find parts of the Bible that they find to be emotionally offensive. The two main ones are the complaints that of God doing evil, and one of them is, and then another one being the kind of they have an especially harsh view of how the Bible commands Christians to fear God.
Well, yeah, so we can address those two. So the first one, I mean, there are various instances of God being, according to them, cruel, which is, of course, antithetical to their nature, and obviously they don't understand this. The one that you're referring to, though, is Isaiah chapter 45, verse 7, where it says that God is the creator of evil. Now, this has caused problems throughout the ages for people misinterpreting it. For example, I have a suspicion that John Calvin may have misinterpreted the scripture here. But in the scholastic tradition, at the very least, there is a twofold distinction, wherein God does permit physical evil, meaning pain, hunger, even death, like in terms of like animal death. So like a lion needs to eat a antelope in order to survive, right? Mm-hmm. This would be physical. It's called pena in Latin, Poena. And then there's moral evil, which comes as a result of the fall, which is culpa, which God does not create because it isn't something, it's a privation. So I wouldn't. So we can't say that God creates evil in a moral sense, which is the real problem here for God, being infinitely good. But he does allow physical evil, and frankly, that physical evil is there because we need it.
So you would say that, so contrary to what Nietzsche would say, Christianity does recognize the need for a bit of pain to toughen us up and test us, and the Scripture says, in the Scripture lays that out very clearly.
Of course. I mean, like one of the highest standards in Christianity, probably the highest, is martyrdom.
That is true. So there, I mean, they would also point to parts of the Bible in which, so when God does something like, say, he sends, he hardens the heart of the Pharaoh, or he incites David to take a census of his kingdom in 2 Samuel 24:1. And then he punishes these people for sinning, even though they were doing what he said, or what he caused them to do. They would. How would you interpret that? Would you interpret that as God testing them, or what?
Well, I mean, in one case that I remember, which is the case of Balaam and Balak in Numbers, a similar thing happens where God tells Balaam not to go with the people of Balak, because Balak has the Israelites going through their land and wants to have them cursed by God. Balaam initially tells them not to go with him because he, obviously, like, you shouldn't use God to curse people, but since Balaam is interested in making money off of basically telling what God to do, which is the way Balaam interprets it, God goes, well, fine, go with them. Like he goes like, go and follow them, right? He gives them over to their reprobate mind, to sort of paraphrase St. Paul. And then there's this very interesting instance with the donkey that he's riding talking, Balaam chastising the donkey and seemingly is unaware of the fact that God is trying to talk to him. And then eventually an angel of the Lord appears to him and says, "You've done this to yourself. Don't say anything I don't say." Right? If memory serves me right. And it's the same with all of these cases where it says Pharaoh had his heart hardened and, David did the census or whatever. God simply withdraws his grace from these people, and that leads them to hardening their hearts. But that doesn't mean that Pharaoh didn't deliberately harden his heart. It doesn't mean that David didn't just do the census of his own accord, right? It just means that God withdrew his mercy.
So you would say that this is because these people have had a habit of sinning beforehand, and God is just just withdrawing His grace and letting that person's appetites go wild.
Well, yeah, I'd say that's the case for most of them. I can't remember the specific case with David.
Well, the scripture, it really depends on this passage. Like, one of them says that that Satan tempted David to the sentence. And the other version says that God told David to do it.
Yeah. I remember, because it's like the first one happens in 2 Samuel and the second one happened in like 1 Chronicles or 2 Chronicles. Well, yeah, it's because God is active in sustaining everything at the same time, so he sustains Satan in existence. So whenever Satan does something, it's because God permits him to.
Yeah, and that explains God. Yeah, because there are some atheists who claim that, according to the Old Testament, that God and Satan are the same being.
I mean, I don't know how they could come to that conclusion, considering in the first chapter of Job, Satan is seen talking to God.
I mean, that's it's a pretty interesting. I mean, they would look at Chronicles and Samuel just doing the same thing, and they come to the conclusion Satan is like an alternate personality of God or something like that. In a way that the Hindus and Hindu gods have multiple facets of their personality.
Well, I mean, you see, the trouble is that they operate under the assumption that if you're having a conversation, that one side of the conversation doesn't already know what's going to be said, which we know from human interaction is not always the case, right? I can know exactly what you're going to say when I ask a particular question. Now, God does this, but every single time because he's omniscient. There are obviously other reasons.
That's a pretty good. I think that's a pretty good example here. So so I would say I would also add for the kind of atrocities that God seems to commit, like say the flood, that God himself is the author of human life, and so, as the saying goes, if he brought you into this world, he could take you out. And I would also add that, as Christians, our life in this world, however painful it might be, is very brief compared to all of eternity. So if God causes us to have a painful end, that's like a blip. That's less than a blip in our immortal lives. So it's really, I think atheists are assuming eternality are not taking into account the eternality of the human experience, which isn't a surprise considering they deny the immortality of the soul.
Well, I mean, they're like, oh, why did God kill the guy that was picking up sticks on the Sabbath? Oh, well, maybe it's because God's trying to tell you not to work on the Sabbath. Maybe it's because there's more than just one person involved in this, and God deemed it so that one person might suffer for the sake of other people learning a lesson.
So, yeah, and then finally, there's this idea by atheists that This is which is a subset of this. It's about the passages that tell Christians to fear God. They would say the best route to improving people's behavior is to educate them on the effects of their actions so that they want to do good. But the lesser route is to force people into good behavior through threats. The greater the power and wisdom of a teacher or parent, the more possible the moral route. The more tyrannical and hateful the teacher, the more appealing the fear route. Christian texts have strongly veered towards the lesser of the two approaches, reflecting the human values at the time of their writing. And there are several different passages in the Bible wherein fear God is the primary instruction given, like Deuteronomy 6:13, Job 28:28, Psalms 19:9. And there are verses where it is implicit or explicit that if you fear God, you'll get rewards, such as 2 Kings 17:39 or Psalms 25:14. These verses are written to appeal to the selfish who are looking out for their own self-interest. And this is immoral, because if you are truly moral, then you would do things out of love of the good and not for your own self-interest.
Well, I mean, to respond to that first point, well, I mean, you've got to habituate somebody into loving the good somehow, and what better way to do that than through something seemingly selfish? And I don't think it is selfish anyway, right? Simply acting in one's self-interest isn't selfish by default, right? Like, I can feed the homeless because it makes me feel good, but that doesn't make it selfish. Of course not. Also, what was it? The fear of the Lord. You see, I have this theory, and I suspect that the data bears this out, but I don't have it in front of me, that atheists have a far lesser rate of not only childbirth, but also marriage. Is that true?
I mean, I've seen that they have a really high illegitimacy and divorce rate, and higher use of drugs, higher.
Yeah, that's not so much relevant. That's not so much relevant. It's more specifically the marriage thing, right? Now, now, is not one of the things that keeps true love going fear? Don't we fear to lose that what we've possessed, that we've loved?
There's a well, I think that's a pretty good.
The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, because it's the beginning of love. How can you expect to truly value something if you don't fear losing it?
But the fear of the Lord that is described, it might be different. It seems to be fear of being punished for doing evil, and fear of God's power.
I mean, you're punished if you go and cheat on your wife as well. Is that a bad thing?
Well, it's not punished. Well,
yeah,
I guess
your wife's not happy at you. You're sleeping on the sofa, or you're kicked out of the house, right? Wouldn't she be entirely within her rights for doing so?
I would say that, but I think what's happened is that
wouldn't it be infinitely more so with God then?
you make a hard bargain. I think a lot of people would say that I think when they think of fear of God, they're thinking of God as some kind of cosmic North Korean dictator, basically. And scaring people the way that Kim Jong-un scares his subjects into submission.
Well, then why does God constantly say, like, I will be your God and you will be my people? Doesn't that imply like a kind of a loving relationship there?
Oh, well,
there's an entire book, the Song of Songs, which is the marriage between God, Christ and his church, right? Like, how can we...
this is kind of the thing. They do have to ignore a lot in order to overcome this. Like, they'd have to say next that, oh, this is just typical abusive behavior. They tell you they love you, but they hurt you.
According to who?
Like, according to... Yeah, that's a kind of an interesting thing.
According to who? Wilhelm Reich? Wilhelm Reich and like Sigmund Freud. I mean, Sigmund Freud had a hobby where he would shove funny things up of certain organs, right? Like, I'm not going to take his take on abuse. Like, he was somebody who was obsessed with applying metal objects where they shouldn't be, first of all, and Wilhelm Reich had similar habits, right? These are habits that are fundamentally sensual, and so the only fear that the only sort of abuse these people can comprehend is sensual, right? So they're going to think, oh, like, this God is telling me to be scared so that I will follow the dictates of virtue, right? And they'll think of the fear. They won't think of the reward of the virtue. They'll only think of the fear, and they'll just go back to, they'll say, oh, like, God not real because blueberry muffin or something, right? And then they'll, just go back to indulging in, frankly, disgusting things.
Well, I think one of the things that we have to recognize with a lot of atheists is that they would say what they're doing is trying to trap Christians into a contradiction by saying that God, like, for instance, saying, and they do this all the time, and it's very shallow. Like, they'll say, well, there's one passage that says that we shouldn't be afraid because of God's love, but later on it says fear the Lord.
What you mean in the same way that wait. You mean in the same way that a human being becomes a human being when it moves 4 inches away from a vagina when it's delivered on the table, but before that it's perfectly fine to just murder it?
That's okay. What? That's yeah. And this is something that I actually covered in one of my previous videos. Is that when you focus on, like, critiquing things in the negative, you have to be sure to lay out, like, what your actual moral positions are in the positive, because if you don't have an idea of what you believe, then how are you supposed to critique other people's beliefs? Because you're not doing any kind of compare or contrast. It seems like your critiques are entirely baseless. Like, I'll give you an example of this. So some of the critiques I've been giving you come from the website of this one guy who goes by the name Vixen Crabtree. He's a British man who runs a pro-humanist organization called Truth Foundation.
The Truth Foundation.
Yeah.
So he denies pure being and yet he believes in truth. Okay.
So this is what he has to say. First, on the subject of human rights, he says, human rights have had a very powerful positive effect on the world, ratcheting humanity away from barbarism, political oppression, gender inequality, and religious prejudice. Humanity has felt the need for human rights for a long time. The derivation of ethics from religious codes has been inadequate as either a source of governance or as a guide to personal conduct. Too many old and archaic rules lead to needless segregation, sectarianism, suffering, and pain, especially of minorities.
Can you repeat those, like, things that abolished? It was gender inequality, and what else was it? Like, that's
it was human rights ratcheted humanity away from barbarism, political oppression, gender inequality, and religious prejudice.
Wait, aren't those, like, the first one is completely meaningless because everyone is a barbarian to someone, right? The third, aren't they just like saying the human rights were really good at solving problems with human rights? Isn't that circular?
Well, human rights were good at solving gender inequality. So we could patch that out. You're not treating men and women equally, is what is being said.
Yeah, I know that. Yeah, I know what it means, but doesn't this, like, this basically is just saying human rights is really good at solving problems related to human rights, right? It presupposes that what it's doing is a good thing. Yeah, it presupposes itself, and so it's illogical.
And I'm not even done yet because he continues. because he goes on to say that the golden rule is useless because people is useless, and that human rights are the best thing that the most successful secular ethics ever invented, and that it solves some of the deliberation overhead issues by stipulating some things you cannot deprive people of, and that it is widely acknowledged that the source of human rights is man's moral nature, and so on and so forth, and that
Wait,
it is
wait a minute.
derived from the dignity and worth of the human person.
Wouldn't it be a shame? I mean, it's not as if a guy called Moses went up on Mount Sinai and received some tablets with exactly these things 3,500 years ago, right? Is it?
Yeah, it's strange, but this is the funniest part. So this is what he has to say about good and evil. The same author, by the way,
Mm-hmm.
who wrote that about human rights. This is what he has to say about good and evil. Good and evil are to many an obvious reality, but with thought, the concept of these opposites makes little sense. What is good for one being is frequently bad for another. For example, in nature, the whole biological cycle of biological life is based on death and recycling. Hence, why major religions have historically been based around these themes, especially vegetation gods who are reborn every winter solstice. All predators find it good that prey is available. If you protect the prey, you harm the predator. And whilst it is bad from the prey's point of view to be eaten, it is necessary from the predator's point of view. In nature, survival is violent and competitive. Good and evil are impossibly complex, inherently subjective.
No.
Morally, there are no actions that are good or bad from the point of view of all peoples, cultures, societies, species, and interests. There is no action that is absolutely good for life, and there are no actions that are bad for all species. There is no opposite to good and evil. There is no scale with good on one side and evil on the other. There are only conflicting subjective interests. It is all personal opinion, compromise, and discord.
Okay, so first of all, where do we get human rights in this mess?
I know, right? It's like,
Well, and second of all, right, like this kind of profound, like, oh, there's no black and white, there's only grey. It's like when people say that, like, I got into the habit of, I think I'd just laugh at somebody if they said that to me now, because I'd be like, well, you do realize that we can split the grey again into the black and white with a little bit of analysis, right?
exact. Well, this is the
Grey's a mix of black and white. Like, so, come on.
well, I mean, it's like he obviously does. Like, what is this? He's saying that on one part that human rights are these great moral things, but then on the other, he says that there's no actions that are good or bad from the views of all peoples, cultures, and societies. So what the hell is he talking about? You would wonder like if human rights are not good from the points of view of all peoples, for all humans, then which set of humans is he proposing?
He is referring to upper middle class men and women of a bourgeois mindset who have graduated from second tier universities.
Yeah, so it's good for them. And
because
I would
see, because you see,
great.
yeah. Can I finish? Because you see, the first tier university people are either the sorts of people who will be obedient to whatever's in control, or there'll be people who are psychopathic enough to exploit it. And then the third tier people are too busy doing other things to really care. It's only the second tier people who actually believe the what they're being taught.
So there was a great book that I read by a Catholic named Chris Bond called Nemesis, and he talks about how human rights, in the modern sense, are taken to exist without justification. So he analyzes the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and he says that the United Nations adoption of human rights, as explained by them, was purely a means to an end, that the end of furthering the cause of peace, and at the same time, appeals to human rights are implicitly appeals to laws higher than positive law. This contradiction, he says, is a clear indication that the development of human rights predates the intellectual justification for such rights, which is still in the process of creation at this very moment. So essentially, what we're seeing here is political convenience and political necessity is created these, are responsible for the creation of these rights, and it's only and we're still in the process of intellectuals trying to post hoc rationalize these human rights, but all the while they're being imposed onto us as if they are true entities.
Well, one thing I would say is that the fact that they haven't been reasoned yet doesn't mean they're not true, right? There's a lot of commonality between human rights and those that are posited in the Bible and posited by Christianity, right? But it's not a particularly encouraging sign if they didn't think it through.
No, I would say it isn't. No. So maybe that's a good way to segue to what would you say are some areas of commonality between the kind of Christian virtue ethics and the kind of secular liberal ethics that we've been talking about? What are some areas of commonality between the two?
Well, I think that human beings have dignity. That would be one. Let me think others. Stealing. Yeah, that's bad. Murdering. I mean, obviously the secular liberals are a little bit inconsistent on this, but yeah, murder is bad. Beyond that, I'm not really sure.
Oh, well, that's actually, that's actually kind of troubling, in my opinion.
Well, yeah, I mean, even cheating is justified in some movies nowadays.
Really?
If you feel just good enough about this person, it doesn't matter if they have a girlfriend or a boyfriend already.
Yeah.
Slay girl. Slay girl.
That's that is pretty So what would you say is something that if you were to have a do a contrast with the kind of secular human rights based ethics that you would see versus a more a Christian politics that's based on these virtue ethics, what would be a stark contrast between the general operating procedures I
would say that the most obvious difference is that the virtue ethicist perspective on sexuality is actually consistent, right? There's no real hard line between what is perverse and what is just an alternative sexuality in secularism. So I wouldn't say, and I don't think they have any objective means of measuring it either beyond people being disgusted by paedophilia and not being disgusted by other activities. Aside from that, I mean, secular liberalism is just idolatry on steroids, right? Anybody gets to believe what they want. That means they can worship any idol they want, except for the things that are oppose liberalism. There's no such thing as a Lord's Day, besides maybe watching the Super Bowl, if you're a more masculine person. Respect to parents, that's completely inverted. Murdering in the womb, perfectly fine. Sex, well, as long as the other person consents, as they say. And beyond that, I can't really think of anything else. That's like over half the commandments right there.
That is, there was like this one atheist YouTuber, I think his name is Dark Matter 25, who made the claim that if you compared the Bill of Rights to the Ten Commandments, there are some fundamental contradictions between the two. And while and while there is a I think while he is kind of over exaggerating, I think there was a grain of truth to that, in that the kind of secular liberalism that is being preached by people like him is fundamentally at odds with what was traditionally seen as moral for most of what we call Western society.
Oh yeah, I mean, as far as the Bill of Rights contradicts the scriptures, well, the Bill of Rights is free to be wrong, as far as I'm concerned. And yeah, I would agree that there are contradictions because secular liberalism is disordered. Because it doesn't even have a concept of orders. So, I mean, can you really call it disordered if it doesn't know? I mean, yeah, obviously by objective standards.
Mm. So yeah, I mean, one of the Alistair McIntyre, he actually compares secular liberalism to the sophists that Plato debated.
Oh yeah, I mean, Hilaire Belloc called it the Antichrist.
Mm. So I think there's a lot of I think there's a lot of interesting material here. Do you, despite this, I remember when I was more liberally inclined, there were a lot of authors that I knew who, you know, while they did profess to be good Catholics, they had a lot of, they took on a lot of the liberal assumptions, and it even said that we needed liberalism to prevent the abuses of the Catholic Church from coming back, or something like that.
Abuses
What
like
would
what?
they'd say, like, how without liberalism the Catholic Church would start torturing people or something.
It's ironic. Without liberalism, we wouldn't have the Vendée either.
I mean, that's it. That's a that's that's a so you would you say that would you say that liberalism doesn't actually condemn torture, or would you say that Christianity is more consistent?
I think that I think that it really depends. Okay, so in theory, liberalism condemns torture. However, the problem is that the way that liberalism is structured in its ethics, it leads to a group of immensely appetitive people. And appetitive people are more likely to fall into sins of violence and sex than uh, like otherwise people otherwise would be, right? So, for example, before the Vendée massacres, there was the guy who wrote what was his name? Dessard, Marquis Dessard, right? Was putting pornographic plays on in Paris. This, of course, stirred up the passions because that's what pornography does. And after this led to, of course, the terror. It contributed to the terror, and it contributed to the war in the Vendée, which had people stripping priests and nuns, tying them together and throwing them into the rivers to drown. Uh,
I
so,
mean, I mean,
that's illiberalism.
I've heard even like secular liberals, like the people at Quillette, who are no fans of religion and traditional Christianity, make the argument that, objectively speaking, what happened in the Vendée was a genocide by modern
Uh,
standards.
oh yeah, I agree with them. The trouble that the thing is that Quillette, the people at Quillette, if they're saying this, don't understand that their conception of morality and ethics inherently leads to this kind of thing. They have no
Because
objective sense of man. They believe that man is just some sort of a thing that can be perfected, and we can just wig history kind of thing. They don't understand that man is set, he is fallen, and that there are certain rules he needs to follow in order to avoid falling into moral evil. On an objective sense, I mean every single human being on the planet. I don't mean those in a Judeo-Christian civilization or whatever they would say. I mean every single human being, from the smallest man on Papua New Guinea to the tallest man in the Netherlands, right?
Hmm.
And these things
So
are not subject to change.
right. So there is an ethic that transcends cultures and traditions. Like even the people who defend universal human rights would argue that they are contingent upon a particular time and culture, and they are not truly universal.
I mean, what is this, Star Trek? Like the you don't have enough social technology to unlock the Federation. Like no, like what was wrong 5,000 years ago is also wrong today, right? Now there may have been different allowances, different permissions regarding certain things, as in like the Old Testament, Old Covenant, right? But that doesn't change the fact that these things on a natural law basis were wrong.
Indeed. So I so do you I don't know about you, but I don't see a lot of Christian apologists that are professionals speaking in this manner about secular humanist ethics and about morals like this. And I think do you agree with me that that's the case, or am I not looking in the
No,
right
I,
places?
I think that a lot of apologists hold these sorts of views, like I've seen them profess them, but they don't mention them that often because it's not very easy to convince a secular person by telling them, okay, so you are behaving in a way that is disordered, and here's why, right? And because this isn't an apologetic stream, I'm I'm not gonna say this to like somebody who's considering converting to the church unless they explicitly ask it, because it's not it's not something that makes you feel good, right?
Mm. So, I mean, we can say that the. So, what would you say to someone who is skeptical of Christianity in the way that like a like a I don't know, a Vexen Crabtree? What would you say to someone like him if he were on stream with you talking about these issues?
Um, I don't know this Vexen Crabtree, but let's say he takes it from a purely moral perspective. In which case, I think that actually I might have been wrong earlier on. I think I would just do what I just did to him, because a lot of these emotional oppositions to Christianity are fundamentally emotional, and sometimes you've just got to tell them, look, you're being silly, and
Mm,
like explain it logically. And then as the person may well freak out as a result of that, but the people who are watching will see what, like, oh, there's actually more to this. Somebody's thought about this, right? Because like, the average Christian apologist they'll come across will be like a Mormon or something.
mm, right, and that's it. And you would say that those kinds of traditions don't have the kind of intellectual muscle that the traditional Christian faith does.
No, Mormonism is a bad joke, uh, frankly. Yeah,
Mm,
yeah. Like they tend, like the average person tends to think of Christians as being stupid. So what you've got to do, at least I think, is that you've got to, like, I mean, I don't know how this would work. If somebody's going to be combative with you in front of a crowd of people who are relatively normal people, you just do it in such a way that it's very clear that these people are being irrational, and then you just outwit them in front of the crowd, and the crowd will say, "Oh, okay, there's more to this than I thought." Um, Either they will have a look if they're the inquisitive sort, or if they like your performance and what you did, they'll just ask questions, and in that case, you can explain to them just calmly and logically what you think. Maybe entirely wrong though.
that's some pretty good advice, I would say. I think what a lot of Christian apologists maybe don't appreciate as much is that I think these kinds of moral objections that I've been covering are some of the rationales more than just the rise of philosophical or doctrinal atheism, the kind of philosophical materialism that you'd see in universities or preached about on the internet by the new atheists. I think more than that, I think the moral critique of Christianity and these kinds of moral objections that are based on really logically shaky ground, those kinds of things are what's really the impetus behind this. And behind that is what, like you said, these kind of irrational passions that are bubbling forth.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I'd say that 95% of atheists don't actually have a reason for being atheist, and I include, just regular secular people beyond, I don't actually know what an adult theory of God is. Then you've got 5% or so of them who have sophisticated but not necessarily good reasons, right? So there are some people on the internet, Graham Oppy, for example, philosophy professor, who has like these at least ostensibly reasoned views for not believing in Christianity, right? But they ultimately fall down on closer inspection. And yeah, like most people are just like either they're angry because God told them that they can't do something that they want, or this is what I've seen. They're either angry that God's told them that they can't do something, or they just don't understand it for the most part.
So, I guess in all cases, what is required is a kind of moral firmness and intellectual muscle. And I honestly think, and this is my advice to my audience also, besides what you said, there needs to be a bit more conviction on the part of Christians. If you're a Christian, don't be apologetic about their faith. Don't constantly apologize for what you believe. That is a sign of weakness. And I think a lot of these people, a lot of these liberals, will pick up on that and sort of pounce on that like sharks.
You never give any of them, particularly the more aggressive ones, an inch ever.
And
if you have to, with the more aggressive atheist sorts, you push them into a corner if they're pushing you back. And believe me, if you know your faith well enough, you can very easily do so.
Yeah, and I would say also that I saw once Distributist gave a good piece of advice for the kinds of atheists. Like if you have an atheist relative or friend who makes these kinds of passive aggressive snipes at you about the church or about God, the best thing to do would be to confront them and say, look, I don't appreciate you making these kinds of passive aggressive attacks on my faith and against what I believe. If you want to have an honest dialogue about it, we can do so, but none of this kind of backbiting.
I wouldn't say that. Like, I can understand why he would say that, but that's not what I would do. What I would do is I would, as calmly as possible, in a way that they are under no delusions about. What you do is you logically deconstruct their worldview, and you make it very clear that what they believe isn't true.
Okay, yeah, that is true. That is ideal. I guess what I would say to that is, most of the time, these people don't understand what they believe.
Well, yeah, of course they don't. But you show the contradictions in their view in a very calm way. Like like one
But
of them
no,
takes.
I mean, it's like it's not just that they don't think about the contradictions. It's like they literally don't know what they believe. They just know that they hate Christianity. I see that with a lot of these kinds of people. Like they do have like assumptions that they're making, but they're not fully conscious of them because they're so focused on this is an enemy that I must overcome.
Hmm.
And I think those types of people are very difficult to argue with because you almost have to build their worldview from the ground up for them. uh, so it can be very challenging to do things like one of the things I do basically is try to get them to explain their morality to me, and usually they can't. Like and then when they can't, I just say, well, you can't. You're coming at me with these kinds of invectives, this kind of bile, and yet you are just unable to give me a basic reason for why I should believe in your morality. I think you should work things out for yourself before you come to me with this kind of rhetoric, basically.
Oh yeah, but then I mean, you've got to you've got to handle the other person's emotions as well. In fact, that's probably the bigger deal than handling their worldview.
Mm.
And I think, like, you see, if you're going to be dealing with like the sort of combative atheist sort, you want to get them so hard that they never mess you around again. But like, obviously, give them reason to consider the faith, right? Just like get them in such a way that they are under no illusions as to the fact that Christianity is very obviously intellectually superior to anything they could possibly hold, and that it's correspondent to reality as much as you can, so that they will think twice.
All right. I think these are some pretty good points that you've made. I certainly will take into account a lot of what you said. I think
What I would say
I
though,
think
can I just make an addendum there?
okay.
The vast majority of people you'll come across will not act in this way. What I don't want to give license to people doing is acting angrily around atheists because they are challenged, right? Because when there is anger, the Holy Spirit can't work, and He's ultimately doing the work. You only, do things like this when it's like the guy thinks that you're, is obviously engaging in bad faith, and you want to make it real clear, right? You ain't going to do this. With normal people, just answer questions. That's usually all they need.
All right. I think that's a very good place to wrap up. I think in all things, charity, intellectual muscle, and firmness of conviction, and I think for all of those things, I don't know about you, but I have to pray to the Holy Spirit just for to have those kinds of things, because I can be very emotional myself, and I need his help to sort of overcome that.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of people.
Right, right. So, is there anything else that you'd like to say to the audience before we wrap things up?
Nothing especially springs to mind. No.
All right. So I'll go over the chat before we go. There has been some interesting comments by one guy. I think his name is
Anisodemus.
Anisodemus, where he says, it's a pretty long comment. We live in an age of credulous anarchism where there is no real respect for the state or law, yet which still espouses a social ethic, and where the most shallow interpretation of history dominates. I have the Marxian line of history is merely the aggregation of material conditions in mind. This is fundamentally an age of capitalism and Marxism in which history, science, and the rest are viewed solely through the lens of economics and technology. Well,
Yeah.
I think that is one of the things we can with that we look when we look at the world, we see this. But I think what I think a lot of the again, a lot of the attraction to those intellectual theories from people derives from this kind of moral system that they are raised in in modernity. And I think fixing the morals, the kind of practical atheism that underlies this philosophical atheism is what really needs to be gone after. You're not going to be able to convince somebody who thinks who is so addicted to pornography that he's unwilling to give it up.
No, I don't actually think you need that. I think, and I think we're seeing this with the coronavirus thing. I think we need a situation where people become so poor again and so devoid of technology that they're forced to look for other things.
Hmm. That might be something too. I mean, part of the rhetoric of secularism is that, oh, look at all these nice things that we have. Look at all these shiny things. Isn't this better than anything religion gave us?
But yeah, I
Uh,
mean, like it's like War of the Worlds, right? You've got the aliens who've dominated the world of technology, and now you have the situation where they're being defeated by a flu.
yeah, H.G. Wells. Maybe H.G. Wells was a prophet of some kind.
I
Who
mean,
knows?
what's Bill Gates? What has Bill Gates and the technocrats done to solve this problem? I think
Well,
basically nothing, won't it?
I mean, Bill Gates and the technocrats, their solution is essentially to redesign the economy to fit their economic interests.
Yeah, and watch that mercilessly fail, right? Like I'm not expecting anything out of like Carl Schwab's. Is it the Great Reset? Yeah, I'm not
Yeah,
expecting anything out of it.
yeah, it was some kind of. At this point, they have this kind of proposal, and essentially, what it is just what we have now, but on steroids. So, yeah, I think Anisodemus was correct in saying that this is a very much history is being viewed through the lens of economics and science and technology, and the world is a spiritually worse place off for it.
I mean, like look at the bright side though, Geocon. You know, we're gonna have our Funko Pops delivered to us by drones. Isn't that cool?
Indeed. Indeed. So I think that about wraps this up. I hope that everybody has a good afternoon and good night, and God bless everybody. Ave.